The sanctuary is silent in a way it was never meant to be. Where tens of thousands once lifted their hands in hope, there is now a pause. Thick, uncomfortable, heavy with unspoken doubt. Pastor Joel Osteen stands at the center of a faith empire built on optimism, yet the glow that once surrounded his message begins to flicker. Outside the walls of Lakewood Church, questions multiply faster than answers. Critics speak louder. Followers hesitate. Trust, once effortless, now feels fragile. This is not the story of a single mistake, nor a sudden fall from grace. It is the slow tightening of pressure, public expectation colliding with private fear, faith tested not by absence, but by abundance. How does a man whose calling is hope survive when hope itself is questioned? And what happens when belief becomes a spotlight that never turns off? As whispers grow into scrutiny, the line between inspiration and illusion blurs. What the world sees is confidence. What it cannot see is the cost of carrying millions of expectations on one human soul. The question lingers, unsettling and unavoidable. When the preacher of positivity begins to crack, what does that mean for the faith built around him? Silence learned its first language inside the Osteen home, long before applause ever arrived. In rooms scented with polished wood and old hymnals, John Osteen's voice carried certainty, filling space with conviction that left little room for hesitation. Joel watched from the edges, a boy absorbing rhythm and reverence, sensing that belief was not only spoken but expected, practiced daily like posture. Faith moved through the house as atmosphere, gentle yet insistent, teaching him early that questions were things to be managed quietly. He admired his father deeply, the ease with which John commanded attention, the way faces softened when he spoke. Yet admiration lived beside fear. Joel learned to measure himself against a standard he did not choose, feeling smaller whenever the congregation's gaze drifted toward him with assumptions already formed. He preferred cameras, wires, the safety of operating unseen, where mistakes dissolved into technical adjustments rather than public doubt. The pulpit felt exposed, a place where silence could betray uncertainty. Childhood moments stitched the pattern. Smiles were praised. Calm was rewarded. Hesitation passed unnoticed. Positivity became useful, a smooth surface placed over complexity, an early instinct to protect both himself and the image surrounding his family. In private, the effort weighed heavier. Love felt abundant, yet conditional, tied to strength and steadiness, to the absence of visible fracture. Joel learned to keep his inner weather private, to present sunlight even when clouds gathered. As years passed, the expectations thickened. Congregants spoke of calling as if it were inheritance, something transferred by proximity rather than choice. Joel listened, nodding, carrying their confidence like borrowed clothing that never quite fit. He wanted to believe with their certainty, but belief arrived differently, slower, requiring space he rarely felt permitted to claim. John's presence grew larger with time, not oppressive, but undeniable. Every sermon echoed beyond its ending, shaping the contours of Joel's future before he could outline it himself. The house, the church, the community all whispered the same assumption, that legacy was destiny. Somewhere beneath the practiced smile, a question took root, quiet and persistent, waiting for the moment it could no longer remain hidden. It was in these early years that restraint hardened into habit. Joel learned when to speak and when to remain still, reading rooms with care, calibrating expression to expectation. Applause taught him timing, silence taught him survival. He sensed that vulnerability, once exposed, could fracture more than confidence. It could unsettle faith itself. So he stored questions carefully, layering composure over curiosity, building a smile that asked nothing in return. The boy became adept at carrying weight invisibly, mistaking endurance for calling. Even then, beneath the calm exterior, something waited, patient and unresolved, aware that inheritance does not dissolve simply because it is accepted. The legacy was moving closer, narrowing choices, preparing a moment when observation would no longer be enough, and the quiet observer would be asked to stand where certainty was demanded. That future pressed forward, inevitable, heavy, and silently approaching him now. Grief did not arrive quietly. It moved through Lakewood Church like a low current, altering everything it touched. Joel Osteen's absence left a space that sound could not fill, a silence that lingered even when the sanctuary was full. Faces looked forward with expectation, not because certainty existed, but because someone had to stand where authority once lived. Joel felt that weight settle on him before he spoke a single word, heavy and unavoidable. He did not step forward driven by hunger for power or vision of influence. He stepped forward because there was no pause allowed for readiness. The congregation was grieving, the ministry was exposed, and momentum demanded continuation. Cameras turned toward him with urgency, lights warming his face while his thoughts remained distant, scattered between memory and fear. Applause arrived quickly, louder than he expected, as if affirmation could replace preparation. The rise unfolded at a speed that left little room for grounding. Attendance swelled. Broadcasts expanded. Letters arrived from distant places, thanking him for hope offered during private despair. Each message carried gratitude, and each one quietly deepened the pressure. Joel learned to speak encouragement fluently, shaping sentences that lifted others while carefully avoiding the questions that lingered within himself. His voice carried confidence, his mind negotiated doubt. Loneliness settled subtly. Surrounded by people, he felt increasingly unseen. Conversations blurred into affirmation, rarely touching truth. The role demanded clarity, but clarity felt borrowed, assembled from expectation rather than certainty. Joel studied his father's recordings late at night, listening not for imitation, but for permission to belong in a place that still felt provisional. The pulpit became familiar, yet never fully comfortable. Success arrived publicly, isolation privately. The ministry's growth transformed responsibility into spectacle. Each sermon reached further, each gesture interpreted with growing significance. Joel sensed that mistakes no longer belonged solely to him. They would ripple outward, reshaping belief for others. That awareness narrowed his choices, encouraging safety over exploration, consistency over vulnerability. Performance became protection. Criticism followed inevitably. Some voices questioned the depth of his message, others his readiness. Joel heard them all, even when he did not respond. Silence became strategy, but it carried cost. The higher the platform rose, the more fragile it felt beneath his feet. He understood instinctively that grace offered from a distance could turn sharply when expectation shifted. As the ministry evolved into something larger than a church, branding replaced intimacy. Faith traveled through screens, mediated and refined. Joel stood at the center, smiling with practiced calm, feeling the distance widen between who he was and who he was becoming. The legacy had not only continued, it had accelerated beyond his control. Standing alone after services, the sanctuary empty, Joel listened to echoes fade. Applause lingered in memory, but certainty did not. The world had already decided who he was meant to be, shaping him through belief and demand. The question he could not silence pressed closer now, sharper than before. In a life defined so quickly by others, was there still space to discover himself, or had that choice already passed him by? Fame did not announce itself as danger. It arrived as attention, constant and unblinking, stretching far beyond the walls of Lakewood Church into screens, headlines, and comment sections that never slept. Joel Osteen felt the shift before he could name it. The sanctuary no longer marked the boundary of his work. The world had stepped inside, carrying opinions sharper than praise and more persistent than prayer. Every pause became visible. Every decision invited interpretation. Silence, once a refuge, now read as avoidance. The message remained unchanged, steady in its optimism, but the environment surrounding it grew increasingly hostile. Joel sensed the loss of safety in small moments, in the way conversations tightened, in the careful phrasing advised by others who understood optics better than faith. The warmth that once accompanied success cooled into scrutiny. Psychological pressure mounted as criticism evolved. It no longer questioned sermons alone, but motives, character, responsibility. Joel felt himself flattened into symbol, reduced to representation rather than person. Millions projected hope onto him, others suspicion, and both demanded certainty. The impossibility of perfection pressed against him daily, asking him to stand without fracture under weight no human could carry intact. Public moments became turning points. National attention arrived swiftly, compressing complex realities into simplified judgments. Joel watched narratives form faster than truth could travel, each one tightening the space available for nuance. He weighed response against restraint, knowing that words could inflame as easily as they could heal. Faith taught endurance, but leadership demanded visibility. The tension between the two never resolved. Behind closed doors, exhaustion surfaced quietly. Joel studied his own reflection, searching for signs of erosion he feared others might already see. Trust, once freely given, now required defense, explanation, management. The cost of being seen revealed itself not in spectacle, but in isolation. Fewer conversations felt honest. Fewer spaces felt safe. The world's gaze lingered even in moments meant for rest. The ministry continued, outwardly unshaken. Crowds gathered, broadcasts expanded, the message traveled on schedule. Yet beneath the rhythm, something shifted. Joel felt the narrowing margin for error, the understanding that intention mattered less than perception. He adjusted instinctively, smoothing edges, guarding vulnerability, learning that transparency carried risks faith alone could not mitigate. The pressure did not explode, it accumulated. Each headline layered upon the last, each debate sharpening expectation. Joel sensed that silence, once powerful, was losing its protective quality. What had once preserved dignity now invited suspicion. Still, he hesitated. Responding meant engagement. Engagement meant escalation. The storm had not reached its peak, but its approach was unmistakable. As he stood before the congregation, lights bright and faces expectant, Joel felt the distance between message and moment stretch thin. He spoke of peace while bracing against noise, of trust while navigating doubt imposed from outside. The question no longer whispered. It pressed insistently now, heavy with consequence. How long could silence endure before it collapsed under the weight of being endlessly interpreted, endlessly judged, and never fully understood? Late nights stretched longer, filled with the glow of screens and the hum of unanswered questions. Advisors spoke carefully, measuring risk, urging restraint, while Joel listened with a quiet sense of displacement. Faith had once been immediate, relational, alive within community. Now it felt mediated, filtered through lenses he did not control. He wondered whether belief could survive such exposure without hardening into performance, whether sincerity could remain intact once it became spectacle. Outside, debates raged on, louder and more certain than he felt inside, and the silence he carried began to feel less like strength and more like a fragile barrier standing. The nights grew quieter, but not peaceful. Private rooms replaced public spaces, their stillness filled with the low hum of thought that refused to settle. Joel Osteen moved through these hours with practiced restraint, his posture unchanged even as fatigue gathered behind his eyes. Public calm remained intact, a familiar shield, while internally the strain deepened, pressing faith into something closer to obligation than refuge. The light felt colder now, less forgiving. Late evenings blurred into early mornings as preparation replaced rest, repetition standing in for renewal. Joel read, prayed, rehearsed, searching for steadiness that once arrived naturally. Guilt surfaced in subtle waves, not tied to wrongdoing, but to an ever-present sense of insufficiency. No matter how many were encouraged, how many found solace, it never felt complete. The needs projected onto him multiplied endlessly, and he felt responsible for meeting them all. Psychologically, isolation intensified. Trust narrowed to a few voices, carefully chosen, cautiously engaged. Every action carried consequence beyond intent. Every word risked misinterpretation. Joel felt himself retreating inward, conserving energy, limiting exposure. Faith, once expansive, felt monitored, shaped by awareness of eyes always watching. The freedom to question, to pause, to be uncertain, slipped further from reach. The ministry endured, outwardly strong, structurally sound. Services continued on schedule. Messages flowed with familiar cadence. Yet beneath the continuity, something strained. Joel sensed it in the gaps between moments, in the hesitation before decisions once made instinctively. The accumulation of pressure replaced drama. There was no collapse, only endurance stretched thin. Private reflections carried weight. Joel revisited earlier convictions, testing their resilience under prolonged scrutiny. He wondered when leadership shifted from service to survival, when responsibility began to eclipse belief. The line blurred quietly, without announcement. Faith demanded constancy, yet constancy demanded sacrifice that rarely found acknowledgement. Advisors spoke of strategy and timing, of patience and resilience. Joel listened, nodding, absorbing counsel without relief. The language of management crept into spaces once reserved for prayer. He felt the narrowing of options, the understanding that vulnerability could invite consequences too unpredictable to risk. Silence returned, but this time without comfort. Foreshadowing lingered in moments of stillness. Joel sensed that endurance alone could not resolve what was building beneath the surface. Strength had carried him far, but strength without renewal felt increasingly fragile. The foundation remained, yet its stability no longer felt assured. Standing before mirrors that reflected composure rather than certainty, Joel adjusted familiar expressions. The smile held. The posture remained steady. Inside, questions gathered without answer. He did not fall. He did not retreat. He remained standing, carrying weight without release. The chapter closes not with resolution, but pause. A fragile stillness settles, heavy with implication. Faith had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, bending under expectation. The question remained unspoken, yet unavoidable, pressing against the quiet. When faith transforms into burden, and the shepherd grows weary beneath the gaze of those he guides, where does rest exist, and who is permitted to seek it? Quiet replaces spectacle as the story turns inward. Joel Osteen moves through familiar spaces without urgency, aware of echoes rather than applause. Reflection settles slowly, carrying weight without accusation. This is not an ending, but a narrowing focus, where purpose and humanity meet without certainty or reward or resolution yet. Emotion arrives restrained, almost careful, shaped by years of visibility. Optimism remains present, but altered, filtered through experience rather than promise. Sorrow exists quietly, not dramatic, not confessed, simply acknowledged. Joel understands now that hope can survive awareness, though it no longer feels effortless or endlessly renewable or unguarded, complete. Psychologically, legacy steps forward as the central tension. Joel measures influence against intention, asking what remains when attention fades. History, he senses, is less generous than followers. It will question consistency, silence, and cost. It will ask whether endurance preserved faith or merely prolonged performance beneath constant public illumination lights. He stands at a quiet crossroads, neither retreating nor advancing. Continuing unchanged offers safety, familiarity, protection. Vulnerability promises risk, misunderstanding, possible loss. The choice is not announced, only felt. Joel carries it privately, knowing that whichever path emerges will reshape not only message, but the man delivering it forward alone. There is no collapse to witness, no triumphant return to celebrate. Life continues in measured rhythms, sermons delivered, expectations met. The reckoning unfolds slowly, internally, without spectacle. Joel lives within constant light, aware that visibility shapes identity as much as belief shapes purpose over long, unbroken years, quietly accumulating weight. Moments of solitude grow meaningful. Silence is no longer avoidance, but examination. Joel listens to his own thoughts without urgency, allowing doubt and conviction to coexist. He senses that certainty once borrowed cannot sustain forever. Something more honest is required, though its form remains undefined and incomplete for now, still. The ministry endures, but legacy feels unfinished. Joel understands that narratives will continue shaping him beyond intention. Praise and criticism will outlive presence. This awareness brings restraint, even humility. He releases the need to control interpretation, accepting that meaning belongs partly to those watching, partly to time itself alone, eventually. Foreshadowing turns inward, subtle yet persistent. The future is not framed as redemption or decline, but as continuation. Joel senses that his story remains open, responsive to choices not yet made. Faith, tested publicly, now asks for private reckoning, one unrecorded and unseen by crowds, cameras, commentators, or history yet. As reflection deepens, Optimism survives differently. It no longer promises outcomes, only presence. Joel accepts limits without surrendering belief. He understands that leadership leaves marks both visible and hidden. The work ahead feels quieter, less certain, but perhaps more truthful, shaped by humility rather than applause or spectacle alone anymore. The story closes without closure. Faith and legacy remain suspended between message and messenger. History will decide what endures. For now, Joel continues, carrying belief carefully, aware of its cost. The question lingers softly, unresolved and human. Will faith remember the words spoken, or the man who bore them alone?